So we're going to go ahead and continue on with factoring. This time we're going to go ahead and look at factoring by grouping. Now this process is used specifically when you have exactly 4 terms. So if you're given a polynomial and they ask you to factor, you go, okay, well it has 4 terms. That's when you know to use factoring by grouping. And we're going to go ahead and I'm going to walk you through the steps, and because that's just the easiest way to learn it. So here's our first polynomial, 4x cubed plus 2x squared minus 2x minus 1. Now you go ahead and you count 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom, got to factor it by grouping. Now, before you begin factoring by grouping, I always encourage people to double check that there's no GCF that you can pull out. So as we look at this, you can see the coefficients are 4, 2, 2, and 1. There's no greatest common factor that's going to divide all of these terms. And if you look, not every single term has a variable. So that means we can't factor those out. So, okay, we don't have to worry about factoring the GCF. Yay! Instead, we can just worry about factoring by grouping. So the first step is to group. Go figure, since the name is grouping. Let's go ahead and factor by grouping. So you group the first 2. Then you go ahead and you group the second 2. Now you want to be careful because there's this minus 2x. The minus only applies to the 2x. So I'm going to throw a plus between these 2 terms. Because if I had that negative out front, that would mean I'm multiplying by a negative to everything. And we want to make sure we don't mess with that -1 at all. So whenever there's a negative, just apply it to the 2 and throw a plus in between there, because we want to make sure that you're adding 2. Now you've grouped, that was step 1, was grouping by addition. And then we want to go ahead and factor out the GCF of each group. Let's see what happens. So in that first group, GCF is the greatest common factor of the coefficients, 4 and 2, greatest common factor, 2. And notice that we have to pull out your smallest exponent on the common variable. So they have x in common, 3 and 2. The smallest exponent is a 2. So let's go ahead and pull out that 2. Let's see what we have left over once we divide each of these terms by 2x squared. We have 2x, because 3 minus 2 is 1, plus 2x squared divided by 2x. A lot of people will say, that's 0. It's all gone, right? However, when you divide the same thing by the same thing, like 2 divided by 2, what are you really left with? 2 divided by 2 is 1. So don't forget that placeholder, because remember, when I multiply it back in, I better get back to that original. Otherwise, we've got some issues. Okay, now we factored out the GCF of the first parenthesis. Let's go ahead and factor it out of the second one as well. Now, if there's ever a negative out front, I like to factor that out first. So we're going to factor a negative out of both of these terms. And then if we look, 2 and 1, what's the GCF? 1, right? So in fact, we're just going to pull out a -1. They don't have anything in common. 2 and 1, the greatest common divisor is 1, and they don't have a variable in common. So we can't really pull anything out besides that negative. So it becomes 2x plus 1. So looking at this, do you guys notice anything interesting? I'm hoping yes. So what's interesting is these 2 expressions inside the parentheses are the same. That's not a coincidence. That should always happen. And in fact, if you don't get that, you should probably go back and double check your GCF, that you either pulled out enough or pulled out too much. So go back and double check that if those 2 are not the same. So we factor those out and we get, I lost my pointer here. Okay, there we go. We get 2x plus 1 because we're pulling that expression out of each term. And then we'll have what's left over. Well, what's left over? 2x squared minus 1. So we have 2x squared minus 1. So we factored this original 4-term polynomial into 2 binomials. So when you're doing this, the only other thing that I would encourage you to do is make sure you double check. Multiply this back out. Make sure you get back to that original, right? So just multiply that back out by foiling, right? By foiling back out and double check. So that's factoring by grouping. As a reminder, you only do factoring by grouping when you have 4 total terms. So be careful when you're doing that. That's my cautionary tale. Good luck.